This recording focuses on doing a literature review. This is a critical component in a dissertation, and it can be something which is quite time consuming. I'm afraid this video is probably going to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones that I produce, as there's a fair bit to get through here, and also it will be helpful if you watch some additional videos which also cover material related to doing literature searches and also embedding critical analysis in your literature review, and I'll mention those later. So, first of all, it's probably best to clarify what isn't a literature review. So what is not a literature review? So sometimes people come across the idea of an annotated bibliography. And basically what this is a whole load of material which summarises and describes material in a list form from a whole series of books and journal articles that they've looked at. It's actually quite a useful resource if you ever come across one of these, but it isn't a literature review. So what this basically is, it has a title of the book or the journal article or whatever the source is, and then it just describes material in that article. So as you say, it's a reference citation followed by a description of content. This is not a literature review, and sometimes what students develop does tend to be a bit like this. In other words, they find a good book, they write what's in that book, and then they find a good journal article, they write about what's in that journal article, and it's just a list of different items. That's not what we're aiming for here. What we're trying to do in a literature review is tell a much more integrated story about what is already known about the topic that we're interested in. Now, we might actually start, as I say there, with an annotated bibliography, but that's not what the finished product should be like. So what is a literature review? Well, it's what we call a form of secondary analysis, secondary data analysis. You're not actually analysing data per se, but you're analysing what people have written about a topic already. Often they've used their own data in their articles or books, but it's a form of secondary data analysis. And what you're trying to do is discuss your knowledge of the topic that is supported by the research literature. So sometimes you have a lot of your own knowledge of a topic, but what you want to try to do in a literature review is actually underpin that with what is known from the literature. What have other people said about this? What have other people found out about this? And what we're trying to do is, I always like to describe it as a story. We're trying to tell a story here. What you want to be able to do is tell us how your particular topic area has evolved over time. What do we know? What do we don't know? Where are there gaps in knowledge? That's quite important, actually. Identifying that we don't know about certain things and that people have suggested that as areas for further research can be quite important for a dissertation. And the way we organise it is we organise it in relation to ideas, themes and concepts, not a list of authors, going through them one by one. So in a particular theme that we're looking at, so say you were looking at motivation theory, that might be one of your themes in your literature review, and you're going to organise that according to different forms of motivations perhaps, or different theoretical perspectives on it, but you won't actually go through it by author. So it isn't a study by study or article by article description of studies that are previously done, and that's quite important because that's sometimes what students set out to do. You're actually trying to have an integrated discussion and tell a story about what do we know about this topic. So if you want to know what one looks like, the easiest thing to do is go and find a journal article, perhaps one related to the topic that you're interested in, and look at it. The introduction, and often the section that comes after the introduction, is their literature review. There are slightly different formats in journals. Sometimes they actually even call it the literature review, although sometimes they might give it a topic heading. So basically the introduction and any material that becomes before a methodology will be their literature review. Have a look at that. That's what you're aiming for. I know you're doing dissertations, but we want to try to aim high, and they should look like a journal article. So literature search can do lots and lots of things, and there's this whole, big bubble on the screen here of all sorts of different things there. So for instance, what are the gaps? as I've said, that can be quite important to identify, that what are the key theories, concepts, ideas. That's another thing that we might want to look at. We might want to know what the key sources are. So who have been the key authors that have written on this? There's quite often a fundamental author who has led the way and other people have followed, and developed their ideas. There's also things here like what are the major issues and debates? So, for example, you have different perspectives on a topic. Not everyone has found the same, and people have researched things from different points of view. So that might link to how is the knowledge on the subject structured? And there's different ways of looking at it. So, there's all sorts of things you can do in a literature review. And I would perhaps bear in mind all these different questions there, because they're things to have in the back of your mind while you're doing a literature review. And then in terms of actually doing it, there are 3 broad phases. Now, I say this, but myself personally, I'm quite intuitive when I do a literature review. I collect my materials together, I have a scan, I come up with ideas. I tend to begin to write and then delve more into the literature as I'm going on. But, if you're, trying to do this for the first time, this is probably what I'd recommend, which is you start first of all with a broad scan. You're trying to develop your topic and work out what you want to focus on. So you need a fairly broad scan where you might skim through a load of materials. So if, for instance, as we'll go through in searching materials in another session, you would look at, find journal articles and look at the abstract. And that's all you might look at this stage, to just kind of get an idea of what's out there. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, okay, there's lots on this topic. Oh, there's not very much on this topic area. This is how they've researched it. Really we're just trying to build up a picture of what's there and identify if there's any particular gaps in the research, because that would help us in terms of targeting our own studies. Then we'd go on to, much more focused stage of inquiry. Okay, so this is where actually you've really focused your topic down a bit now. You've realised that actually it was very big, and actually you're going to focus in on just a much smaller area. And then you can get into some of these things like what are the major issues? What are the gaps or controversies? Why does this group of author think this is happening and another group of authors think there's something else happening? What is the difference in terms of how they've approached their studies? Why have they got these different conclusions? This is where you might identify who the main authors are. So you're getting down to a much more focused level of inquiry. And this is where you actually need to read in much more detail the materials. And going forward from this is a comprehensive critique. This is where, you might identify, perhaps a much smaller number of pieces of work that you're going to look at a lot more carefully. Okay? Then you'll be able to, by this stage, be able to begin to work out, okay, I understand now why this group of authors went away and thought about it in this way, and this group of authors went and thought about this in a different way. So you will actually understand much more about these concurrences and disagreements. And then, you're also looking for this firm evidence to support your research problem, and to try to develop the rationale for your study. So this is where you can sort of say, well, actually we know lots on this area, but we don't know about this specifically in relation to hospitality. All the work has been done in marketing of products and not services. I want to apply this in a hospitality sector. So you actually, you're beginning to kind of see where there's a gap and show how that material that comes from a different area might relate to your study. So in terms of practicalities, I'm going to cover this elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into details here, but I will do a face-to-face session with you online where we'll look at how you do searches and also provide some further guidance on that. What I would say here, I've said at the bottom there, keep records. It's really annoying when you do an initial scan of literature, you find something really interesting, and then 10 days later when you've decided that's really important, you can't find it again. So try to keep records of everything. And actually in the search engines you can get them to do things like email records to yourself, so you can sort of save materials, but do make sure you keep hold of things. And the other thing that's really annoying is when you come to the end of a dissertation and you try to write up, if you've not kept details of for example your references or page numbers for quotations and things like that, it can be quite time consuming finding that. And then there's things to think about, like criteria for evaluating literature. So, obviously, how useful is this material, basically? So, one thing when there's a lot of material out there, one of the things I always say is use things like a book's contents or the index pages to see if they've got relevant material in there, and focus initially on journal abstracts, because that will tell you pretty much straight away whether something's relevant or not. Then other things to think about is what I would call currency. This means relevancy. How relevant is something now? So, for example, when you look at a study on something like mobile media from 2007, it's really old now. Now, the only reason you might want to look back at that would be if it was a really formative study that had maybe set out a theoretical perspective that people are using now, because otherwise a study on mobile media from 2007 is actually quite old. So just think carefully about why you want to use something. I mean, that said, we do sometimes go back to theories from the 1950s. So I'm thinking here of things like you might have heard of Festinger's dissonance theory from the 1950s. It's quite relevant for the area that I work in at the moment, and so it's still used. And this links as well to relevance to your topic. This next point. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really well known. Lots of people talk about this in relation to motivations. It was not developed for events. It wasn't developed for tourism. It wasn't developed for sport management or hospitality. Just sort of think that through and think, well, okay, why am I talking about this? Okay, maybe you want to be referring to the studies that have used it in more contemporary work. And certainly, you shouldn't really be referencing the original source unless you've got a very specific reason for going back and looking at that. And then there's things like who or what was studied. So, this is quite an interesting one. So if actually, the example I've got there is about older people using social media, because their use of social media is different to young people. So if your study is actually about older people and you're drawing on material that is looking at young people's use of social media, you need to state that in your literature and sort of say, well, this might not be that relevant, or it might not be applicable to the people who are the focus of my study. So there's things you need to think about in the background, and we'll come back to this in the critical analysis session that I will run separately. So when you write a literature review, we generally begin with an introduction, and we generally have a summary at the end, to sort of set the scene and also to kind of try to tie things together at the end. We want to try to make a connection for the reader between subtopics and the topic, your overall topic. So so if you suddenly start talking about higher education institutions in the middle of your dissertation on FOMO, explain why, and this is probably because you want to focus on students and you want to focus on what happens in higher education institutions. But sometimes it's not clear. So, one of the things I read a lot of dissertations, and you get this disconnection sometimes. You kind of go, why are they talking about this? What's that come up for? So do think about making it clear to people in your introduction, and then as you introduce subtopics, why this is there. Generally don't quote a lot. Some students tend to write in quotes, and it is awful to read because different people write in different styles, and so it makes it very hard to follow. So quotes are good for definitions. They're not that useful for other things. Try to actually paraphrase and reference your authors rather than using lots of direct quotes. And always cite your sources. So if you make a point and you know that it's come from a particular book, journal, article, report, make sure that's referenced. In terms of structuring a literature review, well, I've mentioned you need an introduction, and this tells the reader what is going to be covered. It's part of telling your story, so it sets out, it will cover these topics in this order, okay, and why they're there. And then we tend to start with a general broad overview. section. Now, the idea here is you might want to cover some background information. So, perhaps your dissertation is focusing on music festivals. So you might want to set the scene for those. If it's music festivals in the UK, you might want to cover some of the background, like how many festivals are there, how the area's grown, how many people attend each year. So it's partly kind of that sort of setting the scene and helping people understand the importance of this area that you're looking at. And then probably the main bit of your literature review is the specific areas that you've chosen to focus on and you're exploring. This is where we're going to go into the detail. Okay, so that might be, the main part, a lot of material covered here, and that will go through in a series of sections where you're telling a logical story and people kind of understand why a particular topic's being covered and then why you're moving on to cover another topic. Then towards the end, you might identify some questions. Don't have to, but it's quite useful. So the idea here is actually, you begin to raise questions towards the end which haven't been covered in the research. So, it's clear there's a lack of understanding about X. We know a lot about Y, but X appears to have not been covered. And this raises questions about our understanding of whatever it is. And then we usually have some kind of very brief summary which acts as a bridge to the next section. I often wrap these two sections together. So I often have a summary or a conclusion which does both of these things, and I find that kind of quite helpful. And I found working with students as well, they find that quite helpful. So, they briefly sum up what's known, but then they identify what isn't known, where the research gaps are, and then have a bridging statement which usually takes you into your methodology section. So this rather complicated slide actually tries to bring both of those components together. And the way I've always thought about this is this triangle, which starts broad. So when you're doing a literature review, you start with your broad scan. And when you're writing your introduction and your general broad overview, you're beginning at a fairly broad level. But as you work through a literature review, it gets much more specific. And so you end at this point where we have a very clear conclusion where we know what do we know about already. We know X, Y, and Z, but what we don't know about is A, B, and C, and that's what we're going to research more. So, and similarly for the doing a literature, you start very broad, and actually, you get into the really sort of specific details that you're interested in at the end. So there's this idea of the triangle starting broad and then getting quite narrow at the end. So, things to do now. It's a little bit to get your head around a literature review, but actually it'll be no different from what you've done previously when you've been writing an assignment. All assignments, or almost all assignments, involve some reviewing of the literature, and so it's not that dissimilar from writing an essay. I'd like you to go and watch the videos on literature searches and the tools to do this, and also have a look at the video on critical analysis in the literature review. It would also be helpful if you went and had a read of the first section of a journal article, because that gives you an idea of what literature is like. You can also look at the past dissertations online as well. Have a read of a book chapter on literature reviews. Now you'll see that I've given you a list of directed readings. Go and have a look there. And there is also a lots of study skills material, which I'll show you again when we meet face-to-face online. That you can look at, and there's a whole load of study skills material about doing literature reviews. So that's also worth a look at, particularly if you find this part hard. Okay, thank you for your time.